few comments in terms of the topic and just to set the background in terms of the concept of black economic empowerment. Ladies and gents, you all know the history of South Africa. You know the serious misgivings, mismanagement of resources, human resources, natural resources that took place during the apartheid system. You know about the marginalization of the majority of the South African population. And therefore, a concept like black economic empowerment was introduced after 1994, after we became a democratic country in the system. But what is quite important and what is quite unique about black economic empowerment, or some people even opt to call it affirmative action, is that normally affirmative action or empowerment of a group is normally the minority group. And therefore, when we looked and tried to compare and see what is happening in the rest of the world, it's just not doable. Because black economic empowerment in South Africa is supposed to address the limitations, the needs, the misgivings of the majority of the people. We are known, and for a long time, in terms of our inequality, for the poverty, the unemployment in the system. And although so much good has happened since 1994, it wasn't just not fast enough. So that a concept like black economic empowerment had to be introduced. And there's a lot of talk whether it has to be a once-off, a push factor, and then fade it out. But there's a lot of negative economic issues that happened since the introduction of black economic empowerment. First of all, the Act in 2004, adjusted again 2013. And I'm not going to take away anything or try to intervene with what the guest speaker, an absolute specialist in the field, is going to say to us. But the concept is that one of the major issues that happened in South Africa was the international world financial global crisis. That didn't have a direct effect on our banking system, but had a direct effect on our economic system and on economic growth and on employment and on exports, on investment in the system. And therefore, this concept of black economic empowerment is three different words. It's black, meaning the majority that was always negatively impacted. Economic, that we are struggling with, and not only due to COVID now, but we were struggling just before COVID. And then the concept of empowerment. What is the policies? What is the issues? I, with this, would like to hand over to Professor Siepi to introduce to us the guest speaker that is an absolute specialist in this field. And I'm sure you will really, by listening to his biography, understand why he was invited to a VC's webinar. Thank you very much. Colin, we are first introducing and inviting the VC. And you're not always privileged to see and to get us. So, Prof, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. Master of Ceremonies, Professor Grayling, members of council, members of university executive, deans of faculty, Professor Grayling, heads of departments, respondents to today's lecture, Professor Tiwari, Professor Kasarem, academic staff, students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and our honorable speaker of today, Mr. Gabi Mahomola. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this week's Vice Chancellor's public lecture we call webinar series. The Vice Chancellor's webinar series were conceived as an important tool to transform the university into a public deliberation. In so doing, we intend to bring scientists, philosophers, and distinguished members of our society to join us in not only sharing their wisdom, but in helping us to engage in imaginary scenarios in search for answers to society's perennial questions. It is about sustaining a tradition of ensuring that universities remain safe spaces for contemplation, for engaging in research, for debate, explanation, and refutation through guided discussions, honest and transparent discussions. I underline. The art of deliberation in universities is a 1,000-year-old tradition. It is a tradition that we seek to entrench at UNIZUL. The idea of a Senate dates back to medieval times. The idea of a Senate, whether at a university or in politics, is that of deliberative chamber. Historically, Senate refers to any powerful deliberative authority characteristically composed with the wisest and/or the eldest members of a community. Today's webinar seeks to explore the idea of economic empowerment in the context of a broader societal liberation. This is the intricable challenge that seems to have eluded much of the African continent. This is a subject that finds expression in our Constitution. The challenge was best captured by the former President Mbeki in his famous observation that observed, I open quote, South Africa is a country of two nations. One of these nations is white, relatively prosperous, regardless of gender or geographic dispersal. It has already access to a developed economy, physical, educational, communication, and other infrastructure. The second and the larger nation of South Africa is black and poor, with West affected being women in the rural areas, the black rural population in general, and the disabled. This nation lives under conditions of grossly underdeveloped economic, physical, educational, communication, and other infrastructure. Close quote. One of the questions when I was looking at blackness in the contemporary South Africa, I struggled with the question to understand who I have become as a black person in post-apartheid South Africa. The question I had in mind was, what impact does the historical, political, and economic change in South Africa have on black identification? I discovered with pain from the voices of other black people that were speaking my language and speaking with my voice that even though the so-called New South Africa offered blackness new forms of black identity, the structure and the conditions of these new forms were actually vested in socio-economic change. Today, blackness, new forms that have emerged in South Africa and the conditions conceived for this are clearly integration, black economic empowerment, and the emerging black middle class. Whilst black empowerment occurs on quite a large scale, the hopes to attain a fully liberated black identity and to become fully rounded black person seem to be failing. To help us think through this challenge and challenges, we've invited Mr. Gabi Mahomola. Gabi Mahomola is a well-respected business leader and banker with experience acquired over many years in South Africa, the United States, and the Middle East and Europe. His banking career began at Citibank, where he worked at the World Head Office in New York City for several years. Before returning to South Africa, he was assigned the bank's Wall Street operations, where he interacted with global investment bankers and stockbrokers at a senior level. Later, he was posted to Citibank, Johannesburg, and left that bank with Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to take your seats and to buckle up as you reflect on one of the most important subjects.
Members of University Executive Management, the deans who are here, academic staff and support staff who might be online, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm aware that this subject has attracted great interest, so I want to welcome you all to this important occasion. This occasion signals the university's commitment to the intellectual project, and the Vice-Chancellor has already indicated its location not only in this university, but in the history of the academic enterprise. I had the honor many years Vice-Chancellor to be invited by Mr. Mahomola. The honor was to be one of the speakers at the launch of his book, Robben Island to Wall Street, which I think is a must-read. It provides a rich portrait of what it meant to be black under apartheid, what it meant to be an activist under apartheid, but it is probably the most honest description of the experience in Robben Island. And we are very pleased that Mr. Mahomola had the courage, both emotional and intellectual, to put this book together. Just to quote Richard Goldstone, Justice Richard Goldstone says about the book, he says, "It's a wonderful read. Once started, I could not put it down. Your experience should be read by all South Africans, and especially white South Africans. I have difficulty in explaining apartheid to my 14-year-old grandson. He is a post-apartheid child, and he finds it quite amazing that human beings could treat their fellow citizens in the manner they did. I must confess, feeling somewhat ridiculous trying to explain it to him." An ambassador to the United Kingdom, Lindiwe Mabuza, had this to say: "What the book so frighteningly achieves, page by page, is to unroll the film to reveal how these apartheid laws play themselves out on a daily basis. The untold perfection of sadistic, animalistic behavior by the warders reduces them into morally and ethically deformed brutes. I was forced to stop reading and walk away as my psyche could not absorb the gravity and the daily human depravity." When Mr. Mahomola asked me to give this paper and to during the launch of his book, I found myself going through the same experience. If I do remember, Mr. Mahumula, I don't know whether it was you who cried or I'm the one who cried, and you cried as a result of that. But I do remember how difficult that is. But what I do know is that Mr. Mahumula, as he will tell you, when I spoke to his wife, says she encouraged him to write this book precisely because every time Gaby met one of the robbers. But what most people do not know is that Mandela found the Gaby in Robben Island. And many of the Rivonia trialists found the Gaby in Robben Island. But for me, Gaby hit the business scene of South Africa like a thunderbolt in the 80s. I was in the United States at the time, and there was this black man, very eloquent, who had spent some time in Wall Street. And he had the courage and the recklessness to decide that he would not move from Manhattan in New York to the squalor of the townships. And Gaby and the bank that had recruited him had to come to an arrangement. And the bank said to Gaby, look, we will be willing to take the commercial risk. You have to decide to take the political risk. If you are ready, then we can partner. The commercial risk had to do with the fact that no black person was allowed in terms of Group Areas Act to stay in areas that were considered to be white areas. And the political risk for Gaby were multifold. One was people like me who would have called him a sellout to go and live in white spaces. The second political risk was the backlash from white people in the area who could not stand a black person in their doorstep. And the bank's commercial risk was that their mortgage could actually collapse and they could actually lose that. So once they had agreed on both the political risk and the financial and commercial risk, Gaby moved in there. And of course, as fate will have it, he was on almost every channel in the United States, in South Africa, and as far as Europe. And as he says in the book, which I still say is a must read, crews from as far as Japan came to interview him, to an extent that some even wanted to spend hours, 48 hours following him. What does it look like and feel like to be a black person who's traversing spaces that are traditionally white? So that is the experience of Gaby. But the most important thing which relates to today's presentation is that Gaby had the nerve to start talking about having an African bank, a bank that is wholly owned by Africans, that is patroned by Africans, whose client base will be Africans. And in that he saw a possibility of a new market. But then that was back in the 80s. And of course, as you read the book and as you also listen to Gaby, he had the honor of sitting with almost 5 presidents, starting with Botha, where the meeting lasted less than an hour. And I don't think it was a good meeting, but at least President Botha was very clear that he didn't take kindly to Gaby's loudmouth about black economic empowerment without white tutelage. So in Gaby, you'll find a man who embodies the many of the wise sayings, the aphorisms. A few of them come to mind. One, he embodies what you call a triumph of a human spirit. If you think that this is a person who at a young, impressionable age end up in Robben Island at the age of 18, having been to other maximum prisons before that, simply to say, oh, he was guilty for asserting his Africanness and his blackness in a country of his birth. The other aphorism or statement that is the one that was uttered by Nelson Mandela, which is very important also for our students, where Mandela says, the greatest glory in living is not never falling, but rising every time you fall. And the last one that I'll put here would be the one that says, Vice Chancellor, which could be speaking to all the university community and the people of the world, that there are three types of people. There are those who make things happen. There are those who watch things happen. And probably the majority that wonder what happened. Gaby certainly does not belong to those that watch and those that wonder. He's a trailblazer. Lastly, as a way of moving off the podium, in this book, you will find what Mandela says when he went back to Robben Island, the pain of our struggle, the sorrow of our losses, and the foundation of our victory. Mr. Gaby Makhomula.
Saw that you have unmuted.
I have unmuted.
Now we can see. We can see you clearly and we can hear you clearly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take this opportunity to thank the university for inviting me to this important seminar. nationalist government was ushering political power. Also, in providing the background I will be taking advice from one of our elder statesmen who served with us on Robben Island in 1964. The intellectual activist, Mr. Gordon Mbeki, has this to say. A better understanding of our past historical development is essential. A clearer interpretation of the historical facts that have led to the present position of Africans is urgent. A clearer grasp of the problems that confront us today is impossible without a clear understanding and interpretation of the facts that made our forefathers put away their shields and spears to seek fortunes on the diamond and gold mines of South Africa. Close quote. We should gather, therefore, from this statement that it is the result of what Dr. Mbeki describes as historical facts that we are having these conversations this morning. My address to you will be broken into two eras. One, the pre-1994 period, which I will call phase one of BEE, and the post-1994 period, which I will call phase two of BEE. Let me then start off with what I described as the era of darkness, phase one. History has documented how the doctrine of apartheid was implemented on and its insidious effects on the larger population was executed by forceful legislation. Some of these laws in question I have dealt with in detail in my book that Professor alluded to, Robben Island to Wall Street, which is published in 2009 by the next year. I will single out three particular pillars of apartheid that affected in a significant way the rise of the call for black economic empowerment. The Influx Control Act was one, the Group Areas Act was another, and the Job Reservation Act was also problematic. The Influx Control Act dictated your status in an urban or peri-urban area. This act was designed to limit the mobility of Africans and, in the main, to control their entry and stay in the so-called white areas. In brief, the Group Areas Act, which designated residential areas according to range fixed by moving out of Soweto into a so-called white area and into the domain of the white area. That was a direct continuation of that act. But this is the act that effectively created the environment involves the Lenancias and the Sowetos, with all of from Indians, Indians from Africans, Indian whites from Indians, and so on and so forth. Thirdly, the Job Reservation Act, among them, prevented Africans from training as artisans. I have seen about this piece of legislation because, in my view, these had an insidious effect of preventing the economic advancement of Africans in an extreme fashion over an extended period of time. Many of the acts were promulgated from earlier and constructed throughout the national took an ingenious and brave act to overcome the hardship by a public law. By way of example, let me share two anecdotes. I was involved in. I was brought up in the mining towns of the region, particularly in a place called the West One, called Untitled. It was a mining town some 40 kilometers outside of Johannesburg, where we were prevented from taking up employment in the equivalent of our currency in terms of the Group Areas Act. Sorry, the jobs, not the jobs, the Job Preservation Act. In order to overcome this obstacle, I cheated. I paid a bribe to a colored family to present me as the outstanding enforcement, which was probably 1960. It took a few bob years, but the dividend of that job was the restoration of the dignity I lost immeasurably by being denied the opportunity to seek employment where I wanted to work. In the process, I inevitably lost my surname of Mahomola and replaced it with the last name Montgomery, which was historically much more accurate. Now I have to dispense of my body parts that I was to carry, forced to carry, and replace that with an identity card like upper-class citizens of the country get. The Job Preservation Act was a remarkable piece of legislation. It made it a criminal offense for an African to lay a brick on a house structure, or even to fix a broken toilet pump, as this would afford you a house pump. It is no wonder, therefore, until 1994, there was a shortage of properly paid dancing and people growing to their white companies. Fortunately, in this context, that is the political, economic, ability of operations, during this period that I described as the era of darkness. There was no organized sector to talk about, and as people were reduced to shopkeepers, described as natural rentals or native trading shops. But credit needs to be given to the likes of enterprising people like the Marquetas, the Msims, the Habakkuk's Iguanas, the Richard Magonius, who were in a small measure, but symbolically large way, giving business to our efforts. There were also others outside of Gauteng, such as the Orkinas, the Gardis, the Ngonianis, in the Transkei of the time, who were also trading regardless. Archie Ngoniani, a Australian Namcock, had started growing tea crops and ran a formidable trading business. Others like
Recording in progress.
ran a fleet of buses and found support from the local community long before the emergence of the mid-market taxi industry. And there were people like Mr. P.T. Gumede and James Moya, president of SAPTA, who were formidable and companies on the coastal belt of KZN. In time, these shopkeepers types organized themselves into local chambers been founded by such scholars as Dr. Influx Control Act and others. NAFCOC became a major catalyst for the emergence of organized black business, and later, under the able leadership of its long-serving chairman, Dr. Samuel Sunyani, NAFCOC transformed itself into a business activist and advocacy group that gave teeth to a growing African middle class and created a cadre of strong and articulate leadership. It soon grew into a business organization with a national footprint. And in the late 1970s, under the stewardship of Monsonyane, NAFCOC created the first black-owned supermarket of scale called Black Chain. Later, the organization created a sizable construction company that was instrumental in civil and construction activities alongside organizations like the Urban Foundation, which was headed by Justice Steyn. By that time, I had come back from the United States and joined NAFCOC and served with Dr. Mutsunyani on a number of forums. One cannot talk about the changing landscape in South Africa without mentioning the role of Urban Foundation, whose role I described in my book, Modern Ireland to Wall Street. At the time, the foresight of NAFCOC had led to the creation of the first black-owned bank in South Africa, African Bank. Raising capital for this bank became an indomitable task, and at the time, it took 1 million rand as capital to register a bank with the South African Central Bank authorities. It took almost 10 years to raise 1 million rand, just 1 million rand, to allow for the registration of the bank. Notwithstanding, the bank was formed with NAFCOC and African shareholders as a controlling shareholder, while the large white-owned banks became minorities through a subscription of mezzanine capital in the form of preferential shares. In 1986, Dr. Mutsunyane recruited me out of First National Bank, then called African Bank, to become CEO of African Bank. This institution, the first of its kind among our people, helped to create the first crop of new business entrepreneurs, like Sam Matuna, who became a pioneer in the manufacture of mobile toilets, and other such luminaries such as Mr. Malope, who had a sizable bakery in Garankuwa outside of Pretoria, and another enterprising gentleman whose name escapes me from Mlazi, who started what was called Executive Hotel, if I recall. But by that time, one of our bank directors, Mr. Habakuk Shikwani, was already manufacturing and exporting his cane furniture to the Far East, based in a place called Hammanskraal, just outside of Johannesburg. What I must also point out, Vice Chancellor, is that by the time in the mid-80s, by that time, the first black company to be listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange had started to make impact on the minds of aspiring African entrepreneurs. Again, to put this into context, this is the mid-1980s. This company that was named Kilimanjaro was the brainchild of icons like Gibson Chola, Dr. Ntata Matana, Richard Maponya, Cyril Cobus, Mr. Ofodi, and Judge Squarea, York Stock Exchange. All of this is shared in my book. So as you can see, the economic landscape was demonstrably undergoing an intractable metamorphosis. Then there was an organization that was named FATCOS, which is the Foundation for African Business and Consumer Services, that I was invited to chair. FATCOS was a federal coalition of several emerging organized businesses such as the Builders Association, the South African Tardiners Association, the Black AK Industry, Black Farmers, as well as the large South African Black Taxi Association of SAPTA, for those who might remember. FATCOS confounded the wide business establishment with its quick growth and phenomenal success. Now, having worked with financial institutions at a senior level, I was requested by the founders of FATCOS, Bakers Mohali, James Chapman, and others, to investigate the formation of a bank to serve our group's interest and the nation at large. Our team did not disappoint, and around 1991, Future Bank, a black control bank controlled by FATCOS and co-owned by First National Bank, was founded, and we made the young Jabu Mabuzra chairman, our first chairman. I served as advisor and director, and the creation of this bank took away a sizable chunk of the wheels business from the likes of West Bank and Stunning, which were the two predominant players in the space of funding automobiles. We later proceeded, still under FATCOS, to create South Africa's first black-controlled short-term insurance company, which we named African General Insurance, or AGM for short. The gentleman called Catherine Temple, who is just passed on, was made the first CEO of this historic institution, which I also chair. And now we have created muscle around funding, particularly taxi fleet that fell under FATCOS, but also creating an insurance capability for these entrepreneurs. Where are all these institutions? I can almost hear you asking. I'm sad to say they were all swallowed up by white capital and subsumed into existing oligarchies. These events perhaps illustrate what Dr. Mtsunyali described when he named us capitalists with no capital. I would be remiss if I did not mention the role of organized professional entities that were created during this period that I choose to call the era of darkness in Black economic empowerment. These included the Black Management Forum, whose past leaders include the likes of Eric Mafuna, Don Jube, and others, Lawton Gold and Don from us. Later, around that period, another Black organization was founded for budding accountants, and this was named the Association of Black Accountants. It's pleasing to know that some of these organizations still exist and will find some influence in the marketplace. Vice Chancellor, me that this historic picture or chain of events helps to unveil a trend of the awakening African business aspirations at the time, which history remains largely untold. So the journey of what is called transformation has been long and somewhat tedious, but needed to be taken. There is therefore no question that African peoples, through their organized institutions, have sought to register their interest in our country's economy over a long period of time. There is more to be said of the developments during the epoch of darkness, but suffice it to say that the Mopani Summit of October 1993, without a doubt, was the midwife of what is now commonly referred to as Black economic empowerment. Mopani in the Kruger National Park, in my view, marks the close of the era of darkness and ushered in what I will describe as the era of enlightenment. Now, having dealt broadly with some of what Governor Becky referred to as the historical facts, let me now touch on the events relating to Black economic empowerment post-1994. This I choose to refer to as an era of enlightenment. Perhaps more than anything else in recent times, it was a historic summit I referred to, which was held in the Kruger National Park, a resort in Mopani, that set the stage for the implementation of BEE. At Mopani, Lord, from the 29th to the 31st of October 1993, several senior members of the African National Congress, which were a government in waiting then, met with their African business counterparts. The meeting that we called ourselves the Black Business Congress group then, was to formally introduce ourselves to debate ways and means of creating an enabling environment. We were introducing ourselves to the returned exile, leadership, former Robben Island prisoners, and those that had left the country for reasons all known to us. The ANC leadership that was present at Mopani included the likes of Trevor Manuel, Tito Mboweni, Popo Molefe, and our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa. We made an argument before these people that while business had been nurtured and freely allowed to thrive for over 40 years under the apartheid government, in our own self-interest, we needed to make a case to the incoming administration to recognize our potential, and we sought to create a sustainable partnership under a new dispensation. In the end, the historic memorandum of accord was signed between the newly formed Black Business Congress and the ruling party. We all agreed that compliance with the principles embodied in that document would help accelerate Black economic empowerment. And the upshot was the signing of what we call the Accord, the Black Business Economic Accord at Shell House in Johannesburg. The issues that were embodied in that agreement and during the summit are as relevant today as they were some 25 years ago. Soon thereafter, a spate of empowerment deals began to be discussed and transacted. A large part of these BEE transactions, however, were structured to favor established large businesses. It is also a fact that white established business, as well as their transaction advisors, mainly white and male, made considerable fortunes from transaction fees. The supposed beneficiaries of black economic empowerment had to scramble for the remains on the table. Second, remember also that we were also new entrants and were blinded by the euphoria and more so by the complex financial structuring of these transactions. It was relatively easy to pull wool over our eyes, considering that many of these transactions were vendor financed in the absence of debt and equity capital from African entrepreneurs. The second phase of empowerment, as you may have realized from the background I've given, was fraught with problems. There has been a number of criticisms from various observers, and I would like now to point out some of these. In his book, Black Economic Empowerment, 20 years later, Professor Pindamali summarizes the variety of the downside or consequences of BEE. These views were gathered from a research conducted with several business groups in the black community. I'd like to cite some examples. I'm not sure if, am I still audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Thank you.
You are.
Am I still audible?
We can still clearly hear you. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Oops.
You are still audible.
We can still clearly see you and you were audible.
Hello?
You are still, we can really hear you. Thank you.
Hello?
Colleagues?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I don't know how much you have lost. Well, let me just, I will continue from where I stopped. Basically, I was talking about a space of empowerment deals that will start doing up some autonomy. And I was, if I still, hello?
Mr. Magmola, you can carry on. We could hear you all the time. We just lost some visual pictures, but you're back and please carry on.
Okay. I got to the point where I was summarizing some of the criticisms that was against BEE, particularly citing some research which was done by Professor Martin in his book called Black Economic Empowerment mindset, or a teacher participating in an energy sector transaction. This, as Mr. Wazi states, led to a situation where many BEE participants moved into areas outside of their own competencies. As a result, they were rendered unable to play a transformative role within these new relationships given the steep learning curve. The writer further states that this misalignment of skills, so to put it, has played into the hands of established big business, which may well have been resistant to BEE at the outset. This perhaps illustrates the ticking of the right box syndrome in compliance with BEE requirements. Regrettably, the majority of such short-term partners are not interested in legacy issues, but many of them are waiting for the big payday. You may not agree with the observation, but if this is accepted, then one can argue, as the writer starts, that in some cases, therefore, BEE policies and practices made us partners in our own disempowerment. Am I still audible?
Thank you.
The above view is reinforced by another observer who happens to be an African chartered accountant, Ms. Coco Tupalo, and a former deputy president of the BMF. She holds an interesting view that by scrambling for BEE deals, we took off our eyes significantly away governments privatize and operating away from municipality chains. Perhaps one of the most contested areas of BEE are the current procurement laws. The Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act has been cited as a major obstacle to procurement by black-owned business. The latter emphasizes price as a major consideration in procurement of state goods and services. But with price being the dominant consideration on all criteria, many African-owned businesses are automatically excluded. The argument with this. This piece of legislation, many argue, has impeded the acceleration of black business participation in large transactions, particularly with government. Ironically, it was expected state procurement, the expectation was that state procurement would be the preeminent driver of black economic empowerment. I think the jury is still out on this issue. In sort of summarizing, I would like to point out that BEE as conceived was and is a significant tool to promote the participation of black business in meaningful ways in the country's economic activities. As an early beneficiary myself of BEE, I and several of my peers in business have had some successes and disappointments. The most debilitating byproduct of BEE, perhaps, is what is often referred to as tenderpreneurship. The rise of this unfortunate breed of business operators has thrown a cloud of negativity into the process of transforming the procurement landscape. Wikipedia describes tenderpreneurs as a South African person in government who abuses their political power and influence to secure government tenders and contracts. Those guys. Sadly, this breed of business operators has cast a dark shadow, as I pointed earlier, over BEE, and it is not my intention to dwell too much on this nefarious practice or practices, but these must be seen for what they are. In concluding, therefore, Vice Chancellor and Master of Ceremonies, Professor Khwen, I would like to take time to extend my heartiest congratulations to all women folk in this country. I have taken note and pride of a rising tide among the mothers, sisters, and daughters of our land to claim their stake and to take their rightful place in leadership positions, particularly in business within our economy. In particular, I would like and others who were co-founders of organized black business in South Africa well before the advent of BEE. Our nation is blessed to have had these brave warriors among us who helped to organize business courageously and crusaded for freedom and equality. The era of enlightenment also ushered in a women's group led by the courage efforts of Wendy Luhade, Louisa Magella, Gloria Sorobe, and others who built formidable and viable businesses on the back of black economic empowerment. It is pleasing, therefore, that to note that these relentless efforts of these trailblazers have resulted in financial institutions and development financial institutions supporting women-owned and black women-controlled businesses. Vice Chancellor, I'm proud to be associated with one of such financial institutions that has embarked on innovative financial solutions to women-owned businesses whose enterprises make sustainable impact in our deprived communities, and particularly in the rural areas. I know you'll all join me in wishing our women more successes in participating in South Africa's economic activities in order to promote social justice. My final remarks would have to do with the fact that the subject I've dealt with is wide, can become emotional, and is pervasive. There are commendable efforts from large business that one did not have time to dwell on, from large businesses like the likes of Axel, MTN, and Anglo-American Platinum that have significantly created wealth for those of our black communities who are unable by themselves to create institutions that we have had the privilege of exposure and education were able to set up. And I'm thankful for the benevolence of these institutions, particularly in empowering rural communities through whatever mechanisms, but including local community trusts. And one such is Anglo-American Platinum, which has created huge wealth within the hosting communities and those communities that have sent labor to their mines. So I'm hoping, Chair, that many other corporations will be watching those efforts, and in an effort to broaden and to accomplish the spirit of broad black business empowerment, and many more will join the bandwagon to create some level of wealth and comfort for their employees in the communities that they serve. I am thankful to the university for having made it possible for me to share these thoughts. I know that there might be a huge number of questions, but I will now give an opportunity to the respondents to add their piece, and once again, thank you.
Mr. Makhmola, now I need to ask you if you can hear us now. Can you hear us? Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, from the side of the Faculty of Commerce, Administration and Law, I really want to thank you today for this talk where you speak from your heart and you are able to convey this message in the form of a story that we can all understand. It is so easy to fall in the trap of giving us a lot of statistics, etc., and then we don't understand. This is a talk that will stay with us, that we will reflect on, that we will think, and that the two respondents are both from economics, as I am, my own training is from economics as well. But where we are going to go back and rethink our curriculum and rethink how to include in every module the history of economic thought and economic history. Because without this history, we will never be able to solve the problems. The new generation will never understand what is going on. And therefore, at this moment, this day, I tell you that we are rethinking and we are reflecting, and we are not making and depending only on our economic theories anymore, but we are thinking about the history of our country and the future of every single citizen of this country. With this, I want to ask Professor Tawari first, and then without announcement, then Professor Kasiram, to just share some of their ideas with us today.
Good morning, Vice Chancellors, Executives, and Council members, Deans, Prof. Grilling, Prof. Castron, and all those who are on YouTube and Zoom. It's a great pleasure for me to comment on a person's talk who has lived the black empowerment, who has experienced it, and I had no experience of apartheid. For me, it's a history that I never heard, so it has opened my eyes today. I really mean it. So it's my great pleasure that I'm going to speak few of my ideas here. So let me just say first important thing that Mr. Mokomola said about the Goban Maweki's statement, that in order to secure, I'm not repeating the quote, I don't remember it, but the gist of that quote was, in order to secure your future, you need to understand your past. And if you don't understand your past, you can't secure your future. I think that is a great statement, and it's a universal statement for all cultures, for all nations. I think when the speaker spoke about these two phases, phase 1 and phase 2, so if you look at in phase 1, I had the impression that black economic empowerment really started in phase 2. Before that, there was no black economic empowerment. But when I heard the story, the black economic empowerment started a long time ago. The foundation was laid, and it's only after 1994 we kind of institutionalized it, gave a name to it. Before that, it was unnamed. A lot of these black economic institutions were created, the African Bank, the bakery in Karankuwa, and many other things I don't recall, but those were mentioned by the speaker. So, what happened in phase 2 when that was our era and a name was given to this empowerment process, and then he says how in phase 2 there was a misalignment of skills, the doctors working in a mining, and misalignment was also played by the big businesses. So why did that happen? That is a real mystery to me as an economist to understand. I would call it, I prefer the word for it is a perversion. When economic policies get misused, misaligned, I call there is a perversion of policies. And that perversion, in my opinion, occurs when those policies are not properly thought out. Something is missing. So the black economic empowerment gave a good price stimulus. There was a good price stimulus. So everybody got attracted. A doctor was attracted to work in a mining factory. He said, I can make more money there. But there was another side of the story, the restriction of quantity. Who can move, who cannot. We didn't control that. So that created a perversion. And therefore, I think when we need a good think tank, then finally I will come to that point. We need to create a good think tank in order to succeed. Because if you see, success, the basic foundation of success is knowledge. Knowledge comes from word. Even probably the Bible says the word was created from word. The world was created from word. Many other religions say the same thing. And word comes from thoughts. And thoughts basically knowledge. So knowledge is the key. In my opinion, we need to build that knowledge base for empowering the black society. Then the entrepreneurship, simply giving economic incentive is not good enough. There is also a story that there has to be an ability to be created, and most of the time our majority of population didn't have an experience of handling or creating economic institutions. And I think we needed probably more resources to go in that direction to create such economic institutions, and so that this very high payoff stimulus that was given by black economic empowerment could be used to mobilize what it was supposed to do. Another statement that struck me, I always, of course, observed it. He said South Africa is a country of two nations. And it's still, I think, in those days it was white and black. Maybe still it is white and black, but still it's two nations, haves and have-nots. There are black people who are also haves, and there are a lot of black people who are have-nots. So, to usher a new era where these two nations merge into one, we need to have a black economic empowerment strategy which will move all the have-nots into haves category. And that means we need to build some kind of entrepreneurship skills. So, nevertheless, black economic empowerment, you can't say it didn't serve the purpose. Of course, it has certain lacunas, some constraints. I'm sure it has aroused the consciousness of black people to move forward in economic sense. I think that is for sure. Okay, that's another thing. It got corrupted. There was some kind of perversion, but it was not total perversion or total corruption. There may be a small amount of. It always happens in any organization, in any movement. That possibility always exists. So the story that Mr. Gabby has told us about this black economic empowerment is very interesting one and gives us a holistic view how black economic empowerment started and what happened in phase 2. Actually, if you look at the phase 1 and phase 2, I think the phase 1 was much stronger black economic empowerment, you know. So in phase 2, when we started pushing it, it started backfiring because we didn't think of the policies properly. So finally, it's my pleasure to comment on Mr. Gabby's this talk. I'm really delighted see whatever my little contribution to make. And in final, I will say we need to build a good economic knowledge base for the black people, for our people, because knowledge will finally remove all these. So the key thing is to build that knowledge, and that's what I propose. Thank you so much.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to serve as a discussant. I feel very humbled. Firstly, let me observe protocol and honor all the distinguished guests and people in this room and who are listening in via Facebook and the webinar. Firstly, Mr. Mahomola, I heard that the VC under breath referred to you as doctor, and then she corrected herself and said Mr. And but what I haven't heard, and I don't think we ever hear this in academic circles, is comrade Mahomola. You know, it's a great honor to me because I was, you know, one of those. I was a student during the 80s, 90s, and I have a strong sort of identification with you for the things you spoke about. Starting off with, you said that it was, you know, Tata Govind Mbeki that taught you that we first have to look at the past, we have to look at it with neutral eyes, we have to look at the facts, and from there we build our future. And I also want to bring in what Prof. Reiling said, that today was an economic history account of what happened in the modern era of South Africa, and you expressed it so eloquently. You know, starting off with the critical period, the time of the state of emergency, 1985 to 89, and that's when you, from what I gathered here, I have to read the book that Prof. Siepe sang praises about, because I think it contains a lot of the economic history that you spoke about today. And to me, it was very insightful for you to call to separate our history into the pre-1994 BEE period and the post-1994 BEE period. In the pre-1994 BEE period, you accurately pointed out the three pillars of apartheid: the Influx Control, the Group Areas Act, and job reservation, which really decimated the economic potential of the majority in South Africa. And those problems, we've experienced it during our democracy, and sadly we are it's going to reverberate in our society for many years to come. One cannot easily turn around this big ship called South Africa into an upward growth without first dealing with the issues that caused this decimation. It was very insightful for me to, when you mentioned, I remember as a kid hearing Dr. Motsuyane on TV and NAFCOC, hearing about, for you to explain to us and enlighten us about how that was the first organized black economic empowerment initiative to the formation of the black chain, supermarkets, the construction industry, the formation of African Bank, for which you was the first CEO. The difficulty of raising R1 million. I was trying to estimate what R1 million, 40 years ago will be worth today, and I think it was more like 100 million. Our CFO probably could correct me, and so that's a substantial amount of money to raise by any standards, and by a burgeoning group of entrepreneurs, buffeted by all these legislations that just prevented one from coming up. It's a major feat, and it's a commendable feat. The other thing is, when we talk about the history of South Africa, we hear about MK, we hear about the struggle on the ground, the formation of UDF and all its associate organizations, via trade unions and civic organizations and so on, that fought the struggle. But what I see here in your account is how you, in the 80s, began to fight, or part of the struggle for economic empowerment. And that's undermentioned, and I think your book plays part of that role. And also, as Prof. Railing says, more needs to be done in order to transform our history, our textbooks, and so on, in order to have an accurate account of the struggles and the development of South Africa, or the advancement of South Africa to the point we are at now. Also it was very enlightening and scintillating for me to hear about FABCOS, the African General Insurance, you mentioned the meme, capitalists with no capital. I think it was Dr. Motsuyane who said that, and I think it's such an accurate account, and it also explains why the Mopani Summit of 1993 had to happen, and all the key the role plays that were there, Trevor Manuel, Tito Mboweni, Cyril Ramaphosa, who went on to achieve distinguished careers and are still, serving society in various ways to advance the economy, to advance the people of South Africa, and I think more needs to be highlighted around that more research needs to be done just around that Mopani summit, and as you said, it was the ushering in of the era of enlightenment, and I think that's also a fitting description of the trajectory the country's history has taken, and it is also undermentioned because we mentioned CODESA, we mentioned the 1994 democratic elections, but we don't really mention how this important event shaped our circumstances to the point where it is today. You also accurately pointed out the spate of empowerment deals being blindsided by complex financial transactions which are vendor financed. You also mentioned the downside where there was a wide misalignment of skills. So these were major market distortions, major transgression of fundamental economic rules or economic principles, where you mentioned doctors engaging in mining deals, teachers signing up on empowerment deals, and it was in order to quickly convert these deals into quick cash, one out of desperation. And you mentioned a very important point, which I would have. Which I think if we are to move forward in South Africa, we need to advance on this. You mentioned legacy issues, that they ignored legacy issues completely, and I want to talk more about that a little later. At that point, you mentioned the downside of BE, where the empowerment actors were partners in their own disempowerment. I think that's a strong point. I also think that part of that was using political leverage. So it was political nepotism. I think one of I forget his name. Joel Netshitenze talks about the incumbency problem, that where people who did not have access to this wealth and luxury, etc., suddenly, it's like a kid into a candy, giving access to a candy shop, and we've seen the issues, and I'm very grateful that you mentioned that the tenderpreneur issue, and you strongly condemned it, is because we cannot sustain an economy based on the acts of looting the economy, looting the state resources, overpricing. You mentioned a very important point regarding pricing, and that what is, I would like to call it equity pricing for emerging black businesses that want to secure state tenders. And we need to engage in debate around what should be a fair price, given the disadvantages nascent or emerging black businesses face in competing with established businesses that have a history of between 350 years, 150 years. If you look at the passenger Indians that came to South Africa, and so that's a whole lot of capital, social capital or historical capital that was built up. Now, how do you derive a fair price under those circumstances? And I think we need to engage in history and debate around these issues. And I know we are short of time, and so I will get to the point. And I think the other important point that you mentioned was the heroic rise of women business leaders under when these opportunities were opened up in our economy. And you mentioned a number of names. You mentioned the organizations that they formed. You mentioned the rural businesses, the emerging rural women businesses. And what I'm gratified to state today is that the University of Zululand is the only university in South Africa that has introduced the whole core area of cooperatives. Cooperatives as an empowerment vehicle for emerging businesses, for rural businesses, and the only other country that has excelled in it on the continent, from whom we've achieved or learnt many lessons, and that is Kenya. And they have thriving cooperatives, and we are just beginning to develop our cooperatives, and I think that's an important vehicle. You spoke about phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 was the dark side. Phase 2 was the enlightenment. And I would like us to forge ahead. I would wish, I hope, I have this aspiration that we forge ahead to the democratization, for a want of a better word, of enlightenment. Perhaps Prof. From the Faculty of Arts, Prof. Masocha, will be able to coin a better word. We were very impressed with your Afro-served approach on Friday, and so I'm sure you'd coin a better word for the phase 3. And so, what I would like to call for is that when Trevor Manuel was the first Minister of Finance, he made a note that at that time, and this is about 25 years ago, so he noted that 72% of the economy was controlled by the private sector, and 28% of the economy is controlled by government. And at that time, he noted that this is a problem, that we needed less government and more private sector. And today, we have 58% of the economy controlled by the private sector and 42% of the economy controlled by government. So if at that time, Mr. Trevor Manuel wanted us to have less government, imagine how much more serious the urgency is now. And part of the problems is, I would say, that bad faith. As Mr. Mahomola mentioned, what happened during the downside of BEE when all these wonderful companies, meaning the Fabcos, the African General Insurance, the African Bank, etc., was subsumed into a white-owned monopoly capital. And now, and that led to a lack of skills, black skills emerging in companies. It led to a slowdown of the development of African skills in these firms because of the practice of selling off those gains from the BEE deals. And so in the third phase, and so this led to government playing more of a stewardship role, and thus leading to a biggest chunk of the economy being controlled by government. And we all know government is not in the business of profit maximization, and so as a result of that, it's going to create major problems in the economy. And so when you explained those issues related to businesses or white-owned businesses swallowing up these emerging promising companies, to me it was a lack of good faith. And I think we need to draw back on our continental history. We need to draw back on human compassion. And so I would say in this phase 3 of democratization, We need the social compact. We need to come together as, the established businesses versus the emerging businesses, the historically advantaged versus the historically disadvantaged. I would like to also, Mr. Mahomola very importantly mention what the Free Market Foundation suggested, that the SOEs, the government hospitals, the licensing departments, all become privatized. I want to add another spin to this. In South Korea, you have these institutions called the chairballs. The chairballs, I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly. They are really people related to government or government associates who use economic common sense. They use market forces to manage economies. In China, you have what we call a developmental state approach. And where the Chinese economy is controlled, or the politics, all aspects of Chinese society is controlled by the Communist Party. And so, it is their network of people that control these institutions. And what some of the good things they're doing, which caused a phenomenal rise in the economic growth, where they took over 500 million people out of poverty in less than 20 years. So some of the rules they followed, they recognize market forces, they recognize sound financial and economic principles, and they recognize the legacy issues that Mr. Mahomola spoke about. And these legacy issues are associated with Africa's concept of Ubuntuism. I'm mixing, up. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to be altruistic, we have to be practical, and we have to be accommodating, and we have to recognize that minorities, the historically advantaged, the historically disadvantaged, we all have a role to play in making South Africa great. And to end, I want to go back to the blunder the VC made and throw a gauntlet to Procurement. Mr. Mahomolo is deserving of an honorary doctorate, and I hope that thank you very much.
Do we have any? It seems they're on the test team, but I can't see them now because I saw them back. Mr. Mahomola, I would like to give you an opportunity to respond to the two respondents, but a question from the floor was definitely in terms of what Professor Kasiram already touched. What is going on in the next phase? What about phase 3? Please give us what next? What to do? Please give us some of your insight. Share your insight, share your wisdom with us. We need that. And Prof. Matosi, the next graduation is only next year. So I hope we will see Dr. Mahomola there as our guest speaker. Thank you. Mr. Mahomola, back to you. Mr. Mahomola, are you still there? Could you?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can hear you clearly. Thank you.
The second one is about page 3. What was the first question?
The question is basically just if you can share some of your insight about what should be done from today onwards.
Okay. I I would like everyone basically this very forum. Perhaps there could be an advocacy and used by this discussion of today for a more collaborative on how this important development of students of the large section of the community can be addressed in perhaps with some additional thinking over and above the tried and tested methods. But I can tell you now that one of the biggest obstacles to the growth of you see, in order for black business to grow, the major driver will have to be government procurement and work that gets done within government. There is a huge opportunity for government to help promote black business. And I go back, I always like to take a historical perspective on these matters. Just after 1994, we had an ideal opportunity during the conception of the cellular technology. We had an ideal opportunity to bring in large black players in a mega project such as that, in a place where influence could have been felt. And to date, we have realized how the cellular industry has become the new industry for similar to what mining was toward the end of the 1880s, when the discovery of gold was a major factor in developing our economy. Now, later on, there were other mega projects that had to either be privatized or where black participation could have been considered. I think here particularly of a mega project like Caltrain, and I know that there are other such projects where there is insufficient black ownership and capital participation, which could have actually catapulted many a black player into the next level of economic development. We have missed those spaces, but this brings me to what is likely to happen now. And explaining the question you asked me, what could be phase 3? I have my own views that is perhaps influenced by what the developments around me, what I experienced in my stakeholders discussions and things that I'm involved in. I think the next phase of huge mega projects where it is imperative to have black business ownership is in the embedded generation of independent power production. The risk mitigation campaign to produce power with the participation of independent power producers has created an opportunity where black players, black business groups, because we now have a pool of sufficiently well-trained and mature business people who have come to the corporations and via a diversity of industries who can participate with large big sponsors from abroad and grow themselves this is an exciting moment because of the challenges of climate change, the challenges of we're seeing the privatization of the likes of large state corporations like South African Airways and so on. And we are seeing the movement towards clean energy, the movement from fossils to renewables. Now, within that space, there is emerging an opportunity for black business people to prepare themselves and work alongside government in a genuine stakeholder situation, invite, but then it should be them that invite. And I have already seen this happening. There's a group of young African group, young entrepreneurs who are moving in this direction. But more important, we mustn't forget that, and I'm not saying this because it is August and it is a month to celebrate women, but I'm saying it in the generality and more fundamental sense. It will be folly of us. The majority of people in our country and in the world are women. And if we lose it, and if we draw talent principally from males, and ignore the fact that males are a minority in a population, and logic dictates that you will find more interest, more talent within a larger population. It behoves us to look more and more at our women folk to open up opportunities, both from the government standpoint and from the business practitioner standpoint. And when I say women, I mean in general. Women-owned businesses and women-led businesses are what is going in youth. Because youth has imbibed technology, and they are the new leaders that are going to create new technologies, create new businesses that are digitally based, and that is the way forward and space development. Universities like UNIZO are going to gear themselves up for this change that is around the corner. This change is bound to happen because the world is digitalizing, the world is experiencing climate change issues, the world is wanting to deal with greenhouse challenges, and that in itself, challenges always create an opportunity. Let's not miss this crisis, because it is the crisis that will create the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Mr. Magamolo, I have to convey a private message that I received, and I'm a little bit in trouble at the moment, because at the moment we have the student entrepreneurship intervarsity going on right here on the campus. And we've invited them, and they have to start with their own things at 12. So I received a message I should not organize something that overlaps with him because they wanted to listen to the end. So sorry about this. But with this, I would like to hand over to the Dean of Arts, Professor Masoga, a friend of FCAL and a very wise man in terms of African thought and Africanization. Professor Masoga, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Grele. Mine is a very simple task. Is to convey a vote of thanks. Let me start by with the Vice Chancellor, Professor Mtose. As always, we appreciate your leadership. And this webinars, indeed, I was seated there and deeply thinking that indeed is really getting somewhere. And taking stock of a number of webinars that we have had, and I think the task will be to put together all this so that our students can use that. And I think this should be encouraged going forward. Professor Siepe, from the portfolio of institutional support, thank you very much for really driving this and so on. Professor Greleng, for steering the ship. You did it very well, and thank you very much for that. I thought, with your permission, if I could maybe spend just half a minute in appreciating Ndate Mahomola, Rema Homola, for the wonderful presentation that he gave to us this morning. And when he spoke about the luminaries, and it was so coincidental that these are the people that I definitely knew. I mean, Ndate Mpafudi, who was in Temba when I grew up, a successful businessman there. And I mean, we grew up there in Temba, Hammanskraal. And then he also spoke about Ndate Shukwani, who did the cane furniture. And he was actually supplying overseas places with the work that he was doing. It was around the area called Itireleng. And then also Dr. Samu Sonyani. But you know, I never had an opportunity of asking a question, probably when we engage further, because there was something about this independent states, what we call the Bophuthatswana and so on, because then you had NAFCOC getting into those spaces. I remember when we were growing up having BOFCOC, the Bophuthatswana Chamber of Commerce, and then because we're still young, I remember in '85 when the then late president of the Homeland, who arrested us for raising questions about BOFCOC and others and stuff like that. So I think it's one area that we might be able to look at. But now also coming to the two respondents, the discussants. Thank you very much for the depth. Indeed, you went into engaging with Ndate Mahomola, with your inputs, Professor Kasiram and Professor Tawari. Thank you very much for that. I think was it yesterday when we had a meeting when you were saying, someone was talking about numbers and weights, Professor Greleng, but I'm actually a friend of economics. I must say that I am a friend of economics, and balancing weights and numbers, it's actually important. And I think the point that was raised here by Ndate Mahomola about the history of economics, and I think Professor Tuwari touched on it. It's one of the things that I think we should look at in terms of how we're going to take this process forward. The book that was displayed by Professor Siepe, it should not just be on the shelf. And I think I promised Professor Siepe when I looked at it to say, this is one major piece of work that I think we must make sure that it's not only in FCAL, but also in our faculty, the colleagues in history. Because I think one of the things that I wanted to do, which I never got to do, it was economics history. I wanted to become an economic historian. And I never, when I was finishing my studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, then it was University of Natal, I never got a supervisor. I remember I sat in one of the meetings, and I'm sorry to make it sound white, but it was a bit white at that time. They were listening to me and saying, but I don't think he will be able to do it. So never got to get someone to supervise me. So economic history is one of the areas, Professor Greleng, that we need to look at, and so on. And so mine is not to really make a speech, but also to thank CMD for the arrangements, wonderful arrangements, very top class in terms of this. I know that we had some hitches here and there when we're starting with that, but those are bound to happen. But I mean, we got the gist of what actually brought us here. We're able to get it. And colleagues who are here, maybe to convey appreciation to our colleagues, members of council who are joining this thing online, some colleagues and students who have joined this important webinar online. Thank you very much for your time. We really, really highly appreciate that. Thank you very much.